German GDP gets an upgrade as importers rush to beat tariffs, but President Trump is now threatening a 50% duty. This is Macro Matters, and we're talking EU trade. The German economy grew 0.4% in the first quarter. That's double the preliminary reading in what the Statistics Office said was the effect of US importers bringing their purchases forward to avoid tariffs. This Friday, though, President Trump posted on social media that he wants to impose a 50% duty on all European imports, saying the EU has been, quote, hard to deal with on trade. George Buckley is chief European economist at Nomura. George, to this German GDP number first then, we seem to be seeing some temporary upside for Europe among the US trade chaos.
That's right, and if you look at some of the detail behind that, it looks like some of it's been consumer spending, but a lot of it has been exports. So there has been some trade effect from this, and I wouldn't be surprised if, as you say, that's been brought forward because of expectations of tariffs and people doing more trade in the first quarter. If you look at what the Bundesbank has had to say this week, they came out before these figures and said that they thought that Q2 GDP was going to be broadly flat. So I think there is going to be some payback in Q2. Not surprising now we know now Trump announced the tariffs. Of course, we now have this new announcement, which of course could do more damage. I think one thing just worth bearing in mind that even though consumer spending was pretty strong, 0.5% in the Q1 data, it's still the case that Germany is the weakest among pretty much all major developed economies in terms of the recovery of consumer spending relative to pre-COVID. So it is a very, very modest recovery. And yes, this is a bright spot, but it's a bright spot among what has been a relatively lackluster recovery so far.
We knew, of course, that US tariffs on the EU were only paused for 90 days rather than stopped, so that's until early July. And now we have this threat from President Trump of a flat 50% duty unless the EU makes major concessions. What do you make of this situation?
Well, I mean, this would be a disaster for trade. It's a significant uplift in what Mr. Trump was talking about doing originally, which was the 20% reciprocal tariffs. I think a lot of people had hoped that the delegation which was being sent to the US was going to provide some ideas and concrete ways forward in which to reduce that 20% reciprocal tariff. Of course, we've got other tariffs potentially coming on things like pharmaceuticals. So there's more yet to come, and Trump seems to have Europe firmly in his sights when it comes to tariffs. I think, from his perspective, one of the reasons he's doing this is because obviously, if you look at trade from different blocks into the US, exports from Europe are I think, the largest across the entire world. Of course, the deficit itself is not the largest. The deficit with the US and China is up there. But certainly in terms of total exports, there is a huge amount which goes into the US, and Trump wants to do something about that.
What do you think European policymakers are thinking, looking at this threat now? What sort of concessions might they be willing to make?
Well, I think they're going to have to be more than what they've currently suggested. And whether they're willing to do that is questionable, or whether they simply say we can't go any further. It's a very difficult situation we find ourselves in. And of course, when you start to see trade break down to this extent, 50% would be a huge damaging tariff. Of course, needless to say, on Europe, even China's reciprocal tariff now has been demoted to less than that. So I think there is a real risk that this could produce a significant hit to economic growth. And if there's any retaliation, then of course it could do some damage to inflation as well, just as we're getting that under control.
What would that trade breakdown mean? Where are the biggest vulnerabilities in Europe?
Well, things like, we wrote a piece this week just looking at pharmaceuticals from Switzerland, which are a huge, pharmaceuticals and chemicals from Switzerland into the US are a huge exports relative to GDP. But things like pharmaceuticals, cars, very significant sectors going into the US. When the ECB's done some analysis on this and looked into how much the impact would be, and it gave a figure which it thinks is even going to be more than that. So I think there is a significant risk that this does a great deal of damage. And even in the ECB's account of its April meeting this week, it talked about the material increase in the risks of recession, not just in the US, but in Europe as well, because of tariffs. And I think if this goes ahead, I think there's going to be a very sizable risk that we fall into recession potentially on both sides of the Atlantic.
That was George Buckley of Nomura. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.